2 weeks after I moved into my new farm, the former owner called me just after 9 at night. Her voice was strangely tense. "Whatever you do, don't turn on the attic light at midnight." I laughed, thinking she meant the old wiring. Then she whispered, "At 11:55, open camera 6. And whatever you see, don't go upstairs." I almost ignored her warning, but when midnight came, a dark truck slipped onto my property with its headlights off. Seconds later, I heard footsteps inside my house, and finally understood why she had called. If you made it this far, I'm grateful. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country. It matters to me on Dad Family Revenge. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Names and places are not drawn from a single source, but the lesson inside every word, that part will stay with you. The 14th night on the farm, I was sitting on the living room floor trying to fix a warped oak board near the fireplace when my phone rang. I had been at this for 40 minutes. The board had swollen from the moisture in the walls, an old house problem, the kind that takes patience and the right angle of pressure to correct. My hands were steady. My mind was somewhere else entirely. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Estelle Fontaine. I had met the woman exactly 3 times during the purchase of this property. 70 acres of Hudson Valley farmland, a century-old timber frame house, a weathered barn, and a small workshop I had already decided to make into a studio. Estelle had been the seller. Our conversations had been brief and professional. She was a tall woman in her mid-70s, silver hair cut close to her head, with the kind of eyes that made you feel she was counting your words before you finished saying them. I picked up. "Mrs. Fontaine." "Mr. Prescott." Her voice was unhurried, deliberate. "Are you alone right now?" I looked around the room. Moving boxes still stacked against the far wall. Eleanor's reading chair, which I had brought from the old house in Manhattan because I could not bring myself to sell it. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "Are Vivian and Dominic there with you?" My chest tightened. Vivian was my daughter. Dominic Hale was her husband of 9 years. He had worked at my firm, Prescott Design Group, for nearly a decade. He was the one who had found this property and sent me the listing with a note that read, "This one feels like you, Walter." "No," I said carefully. "They're not here." "What's going on?" There was a pause. Not the hesitation of someone unsure what to say, but the pause of someone deciding exactly how much to say. Night. Estelle said, "Do not turn on the attic light at midnight." I almost laughed. "I'm sorry. I'm serious, Mr. Prescott." "Is there an electrical issue?" "No." "Then why?" Her voice dropped lower. "When I lived there, we had some equipment stolen from the barn. I installed 8 cameras on the property. Most of them have been removed, but a few are still active and I haven't transferred access to you yet." My hand tightened around the phone. "What have you seen?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she read me a web address and a password slowly twice. "Camera number 6, she said. "Open it at 11:55. Mrs. Fontaine." My voice came out harder than I intended. "Why won't you just tell me what you saw?" "Because if I tell you," she said, "you'll think I'm a paranoid old woman. But if you see it yourself, you'll know exactly what you're looking at." I stood up from the floor. My knees ached from sitting on the hardwood. Outside, the Hudson Valley night was quiet, the kind of deep country quiet that Manhattan had never once offered me in 40 years. "And Mr. Prescott," she added just before I could speak again. "Yes." Whatever you see tonight, do not go up to that attic. The call ended. I stood in the middle of the room with the phone in my hand, my heart knocking against my ribs in a way I hadn't felt since the morning I got the call about Eleanor. I told myself it was nothing, an old woman's worry, a misunderstanding. I told myself I was 68 years old and had spent 4 decades reading structures I did not spook easily. I told myself all of that. And then I opened the laptop. At 11:57, camera 6 picked up movement. A dark pickup truck rolled in from the service road at the back of the property. No headlights. My throat went dry. The truck stopped behind the barn. 2 doors opened. 2 people stepped out. I leaned so close to the screen that my breath fogged the glass. The woman moved first, and even in the grainy footage, even in the dark, I recognized the way she walked. The slight forward lean of someone always in a hurry. The quick, certain steps. Vivian, my daughter. The man beside her was Dominic. He moved to the side door of the house, my house, the house I had owned for 14 days, and used a key. A key I had never given him. 30 seconds later, I heard footsteps inside the house. They moved through the hallway, up the staircase. Not once did either of them call out. Not once did I hear, "Dad, are you awake? Is everything okay?" They went straight to the attic. I walked to the bottom of the stairs, my sock feet soundless on the old pine floor. From above came the sound of something heavy being dragged. Then Dominic's voice, low and clipped. "This one first." Vivian answered, her voice tight with urgency. "No. The blue folder goes first. We don't have much time." "I know that, Dominic." A pause. Then my daughter said something that turned my blood to ice water. "If Dad finds any of this before we've moved at all, everything is over." My chest seized. My hand found the stair rail and gripped it hard enough that my knuckles ached. I am an architect. I have spent my life reading structures, understanding not just what a building looks like, but what it is holding, what it is hiding, what is happening inside the walls you cannot see. I did not go up those stairs. I walked back to my bedroom, lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. I waited. At 12:38, I heard the side door close. The truck started. Tires on gravel fading down the service road, then gone. I waited 20 more minutes. Then I went up to the attic. Nothing looked disturbed. A few storage boxes, old furniture, the rolled drawings I had brought from my Manhattan office. Everything exactly as I had left it. But I was not looking for objects. I was measuring. The room read as approximately 19 feet wide. I walked to the east wall and pressed my palm flat against it. Then I went outside in the dark in my socks and measured the exterior of the house. 23 feet, 8 inches. I stood in the cold night air and looked up at the house. 4.5 feet had disappeared. In architecture, space does not vanish. It does not evaporate or shrink. When a room measures smaller than the building that contains it, there is only one explanation. Someone built a wall where there should not be one. Someone had something to hide. I did not sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers until 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around me. Every creak of the timber frame, every shift of the floorboards felt different now, like a building I thought I understood had just shown me a room I had never been allowed to enter. By 5:30, I was at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the tape measure still in my hand. 4.5 feet. Gone. I called Estelle at 7. She picked up on the first ring as though she had been waiting. "You measured it," she said. Not a question. 4.5 feet off the east wall. My voice came out flat, controlled. "How long have you been watching them?" A pause. Then quietly, A few months. I didn't know who they were at first. My neighbor Helen Marsh, she's got the property just east of yours. She noticed the truck first, started keeping an eye on the road. She told me what she'd seen. Do you have the footage saved? Every bit of it. Don't send it by email, I said. Don't send it any way at all. I'll come to you. Why not email? Because I don't yet know who's watching what. There was a brief pause, and then Estelle said something that surprised me. You're starting to think like a judge. I almost asked her what she meant by that. Instead, I said, I'll call you this afternoon, and ended the call. The second call was to Marcus Bellamy. Marcus had run a private investigations firm out of Albany for going on 25 years. I had designed his office building back when he was just getting started, a converted Victorian on Washington Avenue that he had wanted to feel like a library and work like a precinct. We had stayed in loose contact ever since. He was the kind of man who never asked a question twice and never forgot an answer. I told him half of what I knew. That was enough. Don't touch anything up there, he said. I mean nothing. Not a box, not a folder, not a piece of tape. I'll be there by 10. He arrived at 10:22, which for Marcus was practically running late. He came through the front door with a canvas bag over one shoulder and snapped on a pair of nitrile gloves before he had even reached the bottom of the stairs. Fingerprints, he said when he saw me looking. Whatever's up there, we want it clean. We want it usable. We went up together. I showed him the east wall. He pressed his knuckles against it in 3 places, listening. The sound was unmistakable. The hollow knock of empty space behind a surface that had been built to look solid. He ran his fingers along the seam where the panel met the wall, found the edge, and worked it loose. Behind it was a narrow door, flush with the framing painted the exact same shade as the surrounding drywall. If you didn't know it was there, you would never see it. If you were an architect who had just spent the night measuring discrepancies, you had known it was there since 5:30 that morning. Marcus eased the door open. 3 plastic storage bins stacked neatly, the kind you buy at any hardware store. Ordinary. Anonymous. On the top of the 3rd bin, a strip of white label tape with 3 words written in black marker, Walter Prescott. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Marcus lifted the lid without a word. Inside were documents, stacks of them paper-clipped and organized with a neatness that made my skin crawl. Whoever had put these here had not been in a hurry. They had been careful, methodical. I reached for the top page and Marcus caught my wrist. Gloves first. He handed me a pair. I pulled them on and picked up the first document. It was a power of attorney. My name at the top, my signature at the bottom, granting Dominic Hale full authority to act on my behalf in all business and financial matters related to Prescott Design Group. My handwriting, my signature. Except I had never signed it. I had never seen it in my life. My hands started to shake. Not the trembling of fear, the trembling of a man whose body understands something terrible before his mind has fully caught up. I set the document down carefully and picked up the next one. A board resolution. Then a series of intellectual property transfer agreements. Every design, every project, every drawing that bore the name of my firm being signed over to entities I had never heard of. Marcus. My voice cracked on his name. I see it. These are forgeries. I know. Then he pulled out a bound stack of printed emails. They were addressed from my account. In them, I was directing wire transfers between shell companies, authorizing payments, approving transactions. I had not sent a single one. I set the papers down and pressed both hands flat on the dusty floor of that hidden room, steadying myself. 40 years. 40 years of work of drafting tables and site visits and client meetings and buildings that still stood all across the state of New York. Every bit of it reduced to a stack of forged documents in a plastic bin with my name on a piece of label tape. "They're not just stealing the company," I said. Marcus looked at me over the top of the documents. "No, they're building a story." I straightened up slowly, my knees aching, my chest tight. "In this story, I authorized everything. I moved the money. I signed the transfers. And when it all falls apart, the paper trail leads back to you," Marcus said. "A man who just retired. A man living alone on a farm. A man with no one watching what he signs." Marcus set the emails down and pulled out his phone. That afternoon, Vivian called. Her voice was warm and easy the way it always was on a Sunday. "Hey, Dad. How are you settling in?" My jaw tightened. I forced my voice into something that sounded like normal. "Good," I said. "Tired, though. I keep forgetting things. Where I put the tape measure, what I walked into a room for. Must be the move." There was a pause on her end. Just 1 second, barely a breath. But I had been reading structures for 4 decades. I knew what a stress fracture sounded like. "You're forgetting things." Her voice had shifted. Softer now. Careful. "Just little things," I said. "You know how it is, Dad." She let the words sit there. "Maybe you should make an appointment with Dr. Moss." I caught Marcus's eye across the kitchen table. He was already writing in his notebook. Marcus was still at the kitchen table when I came back inside from washing my hands at the barn sink. He had not touched his coffee. He was staring at my phone. Not at the screen. At the phone itself. The way a man stares at something when he already knows what it is and is deciding how to say it out loud. "Put it down," he said. "Set it on the table and step away from it." I did. "How long have you had this phone?" 3 years. Maybe 4. "Did Dominic ever handle it? Borrow it, set it up for you? Help you with an update?" My stomach turned over slowly, like a stone rolling downhill. "He set up my new carrier plan last spring. He said he'd take care of the transfer so I wouldn't have to go into the store." Marcus exhaled through his nose. It was the closest thing to an emotional reaction I had ever seen from him. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small device, a handheld RF signal detector, the kind that looks like a television remote and costs more than most people's car payments. He ran it along the edges of my phone. The device beeped twice, sharp and certain. "Spyware," he said. "It's been sitting on here for months. Every call you make, every text you send someone on the other end has been reading it in real time." The room felt like it tilted. I reached for the counter to steady myself, my fingers gripping the edge of the butcher block so hard my knuckles went white. "Dominic," I said. "Almost certainly. It explains how he knew you were forgetting things before Vivian suggested Moss. He wasn't guessing." Marcus set the detector down. He was listening. "Can you remove it?" "Already did." He slid the phone back across the table toward me. "But from here on, anything important, we use my phone. We assume yours was compromised for at least the past 2 weeks. Anything you said out loud near it, anything you typed, treat it as known." I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. My chest ached with a dull, persistent pressure, the kind that has nothing to do with your heart, and everything to do with the realization that someone you trusted had been inside your life without your knowledge. Listening, recording, planning. "How long?" I asked. "How long has this been in the works?" "That," Marcus said, opening his laptop, is what I'm going to find out. He worked for 40 minutes without speaking. I made a fresh pot of coffee that neither of us drank and stood at the kitchen window, watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the far field. Eleanor had loved hawks. She used to say they were proof that patience was a form of power. I was thinking about that when Marcus said, Arthur Gaines called you this morning. I turned around. I saw the missed call. I didn't recognize the number. It's a new number. He changed it last month. Marcus turned the laptop to face me. He got a notice from his bank 3 days ago. A wire transfer in his name, $62,000 moving out of an account he didn't know existed. His name on the paperwork. His signature on the authorization. Arthur Gaines had been my partner at Prescott Design Group for 11 years before he retired. A quiet man, meticulous, the kind of architect who checked his measurements 3 times, not because he doubted himself, but because he respected the work. We had stayed close. He came to Eleanor's funeral. He sent a card every Christmas that always contained exactly 2 sentences. One about the weather in Vermont, where he had retired, and one about a building he had seen recently that he thought I would appreciate. His signature is forged, I said. Down to the pen pressure. Marcus pointed to a scanned image on the screen. Whoever did this has been practicing. This isn't a quick copy, this took time. They needed a second name on the corporate documents. I said, feeling the pieces drop into place the way structural elements do when you finally understand the load path. Arthur's name gave them legitimacy. A retired founding partner co-authorizing a transition. It looks clean. Arthur knows something is wrong. He's been trying to reach you since yesterday morning. Marcus picked up his own phone and held it out to me. Call him. Use this. Arthur picked up before the second ring. Walter. His voice cracked on my name. The rough, startled crack of a 70-year-old man who had spent 3 days frightened and had no one to tell. Walter, I have been trying to reach you. Something is very wrong. I know, Arthur. My own throat tightened. I know. I need you to listen to me. Do you still have copies of the original partnership documents? The ones from when we restructured in 2009? I have everything. He sounded steadier now, something to hold on to. I kept it all. You know me. I do. Don't send anything electronically. Don't talk to anyone at the firm. Not until I tell you it's safe. I paused. And Arthur, how many documents have your name on them? The ones you didn't sign. The silence on his end lasted long enough that my heart rate climbed. Walter, he said finally, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. I counted at least 14. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment. Outside, the hawk had landed on the fence post at the edge of the far field, perfectly still, watching. Marcus had his laptop open again. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, pulling records, cross-referencing names, following the thread of money, the way a good investigator follows any trail, not by chasing it, but by understanding where it was always going to lead. Grant Halford, he said, without looking up. 57 years old, based out of Los Angeles. 4 prior fraud convictions, 2 in Fulton County, Georgia, 2 in Charleston, South Carolina. All real estate related. All targeting asset-rich individuals over 60. He paused. He's currently operating under a company called Coastal Legacy Properties, LLC. Registered in Delaware. No active business license in New York. Delaware registration. I knew what that meant. A Delaware LLC offered maximum ownership concealment. You could register a company there without disclosing who actually controlled it. It was the preferred structure of people who needed a business address without a paper trail that led back to their face. And behind Halford? I asked. Marcus typed for another 30 seconds. Douglas Fenn, he said. 63, Los Angeles. No prior convictions, he's careful, uses other people to take the risk. He turned the laptop to face me. Halford is the operation. Fenn is the architecture. I looked at the two names on the screen. Then I looked at the notepad on the table where Marcus had written 5 others: Dominic, Vivian, Moss, Halford, Stahl, and now Fenn. 6 points of load on a structure built to collapse on top of me. This isn't Dominic running a scheme, I said. Dominic was recruited into one. Marcus looked at me steadily. Which means it's bigger than your firm, your farm, and your retirement account. He closed the laptop. And Walter, they have done this before. Many times. And they have never once left enough evidence behind to be convicted. He let that sit in the air between us. Then he added very quietly, until now. I have designed buildings in 31 states. I have looked at a site where there was nothing but dirt and rock and wind, and I have seen in my mind what could stand there, what should stand there, down to the angle of the light at 4 in the afternoon in December. I have read structural drawings the way other people read novels, finding the story in the load paths. The tension points the places where the architect made a decision that would outlast everyone who ever walked through the front door. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of drafting paper, and I did something I had never done in 40 years of professional practice. I drew a building I was trying to tear down. I started with the foundation. 5 names: Dominic, Vivian, Moss, Halford, Fenn, each one a column, each column carrying a different kind of weight. Dominic was the access point. He had my firm, my trust, my daughter. Halford was the acquisition mechanism, the man who knew how to move assets across state lines without leaving a clean trail. Fenn was the engineer of the whole structure, the one who had designed this scheme and run it in 3 other states before anyone noticed. Moss was the instrument of disqualification, the man whose job was to make sure that if I ever tried to fight back, no one would believe me. And Stahl. Humphrey Stahl. A name Marcus had found the night before, a notary public out of Kingston, New York, whose stamp appeared on every forged document in those bins. The man who had made the forgeries official. I drew lines between them. I drew the load paths where the pressure flowed, where the structure was strongest, where it was most vulnerable. Then I called Evangeline Thorne. She was a senior partner at a firm in Manhattan that occupied the 14th floor of a building I had helped renovate in 2007. I had worked with her on 2 commercial property disputes and one very complicated easement case that had taken 3 years to resolve. She was 62 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of a legal mind so precise that opposing counsel had once described her in a deposition as a surgeon operating without anesthesia. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Walter. Her voice was warm and professional at the same time, the way hers always was. It's been a while. Are you calling to tell me retirement agrees with you? I'm calling because I need you, I said. And I need you to clear your afternoon. There was a beat of silence, not hesitation, just recalibration. Tell me. I told her everything. All of it in order, the way I had organized it in my mind since 5 that morning. The hidden room. The forged documents. The power of attorney bearing my signature. The spyware on my phone. Arthur Gaines's 14 forged authorizations. Grant Halford's 4 prior convictions. Douglas Fenn operating from Los Angeles behind a Delaware LLC. Evangeline did not interrupt once. I could hear her pen moving. When I finished, she said, "The power of attorney is the spine of this. Under New York General Obligations Law, Article 5B, A validly executed POA gives the agent, in this case, Dominic, full authority to act on your behalf without your presence or approval. Every transaction he's made using that document, every contract he's signed, every transfer he's authorized, it all traces back to your name. Which means if I try to challenge it, you'll need to prove it was fraudulently executed. Forged signature, improper notarization, or both. She paused. Who is the notary? Humphrey Stahl, Kingston. I heard her write the name. I'll have someone pull his commission records today. Another pause, longer this time. Walter Marcus told me about the bank records he's been tracing. Before we go any further, has anyone approached you about your cognitive health? My jaw tightened. Vivian suggested I see my doctor, a man named Gerald Moss. I've been his patient for 12 years. Don't go yet. Her voice sharpened. Not until we know what he's been paid to find. Marcus had already found it by noon. He called me on his phone. We had stopped using mine for anything that mattered, and read the figures in the flat, careful tone he used when the news was bad enough that drama would be wasteful. $45,000, he said. Paid through a consulting company called Meridian Advisory Services, LLC. Incorporated in Nevada, no employees, no website, no business history. The payment cleared 6 weeks ago. The receiving account is registered to a Gerald R. Moss at a practice address in Kingston. I was standing in the workshop when he told me. I had gone out there to think the smell of sawdust and linseed oil had always helped me concentrate, going back to my first job site at 24 years old. I set my hand flat on the workbench and steadied myself. 12 years. Gerald Moss had sat beside Eleanor's hospital bed in her final weeks and held her chart like it was something sacred. He had called me at 2 a.m. to tell me she was gone, and his voice had broken on the word gone in a way that had made me feel, in that terrible moment, slightly less alone. He's going to declare me incompetent, I said. Worse, Marcus said. He's already filed a petition. My hand gripped the workbench edge so hard the wood bit into my palm. What kind of petition? Legal guardianship. Under New York Mental Hygiene Law Article 81, a physician can petition the court to appoint a guardian for an individual deemed unable to manage their personal and financial affairs. If the court grants it, I lose the right to sign anything. My voice came out hollow. I lose the right to contest anything. I become legally invisible, and Dominic, as your closest family member in the state, becomes the natural candidate for guardian. I released the workbench. My palm was red where the wood had pressed into it. He wouldn't need the forged power of attorney anymore. He'd have a court order. Evangeline is filing a counter-petition as of this afternoon, Marcus said. But Walter, the clock on this just got shorter. If that guardianship petition moves forward before we have enough documented evidence to challenge it, you lose the legal standing to fight back. I looked around the workshop, at the drafting table I had set up against the east wall, at the rolled blueprints from my last 3 projects still leaning in the corner, tied with rubber bands, smelling faintly of ammonia and graphite. At the life I had carried here from 40 years of work and laid down carefully the way you lay down something you intend to pick back up. How much time do we have? I asked. Evangeline says the counter-petition buys us 10 days, maybe 12. Marcus's voice was steady. After that, we need everything. Every piece. Airtight. I walked back to the kitchen table and looked at the drawing I had made that morning. 6 columns. 6 load points. The structure of a lie built to crush one man. I picked up my pen. Then we start pulling columns, I said. One at a time. The waiting room of Gerald Moss's practice smelled the way doctors' offices always smell: antiseptic and old magazines and the particular staleness of recycled air that has heard too many difficult conversations. I had been sitting in that waiting room on and off for 12 years. I knew which chair had the broken armrest. I knew the receptionist's name was Linda and that she kept a photograph of her golden retriever on the corner of her desk. I knew that the watercolor print above the door to the examination hallway had been hanging slightly crooked since 2019 and that no one had ever fixed it. I sat down in my usual chair and folded my hands in my lap and reminded myself that the man I was about to see had been paid $45,000 to destroy me. Linda smiled at me from behind the desk. "Mr. Prescott, it's good to see you. Go ahead and head on back. Dr. Moss is ready for you." The examination room was small and bright, the way they always are. Gerald Moss was already standing when I came in. His hand extended, his face arranged in the expression I had seen 100 times: warm, professional, unhurried. He was 61 years old, trim with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the easy manner of a man who had long ago made peace with knowing things other people did not want to know. For 12 years I had found that manner comforting. "Walter," he shook my hand firmly. "Vivian mentioned you'd been having some trouble. I'm glad you came in." "She worries," I said. I kept my voice slightly vague, a little slower than usual. "You know how she is. That's what family is for." He gestured to the chair beside the examination table. Sit down, sit down. Let's just have a conversation. Nothing formal." He asked me the standard orientation questions first. The date, the day of the week, the current president. I answered those correctly. Getting them all wrong would have been too obvious. Then he moved into the memory portion. He read me a list of 5 words and asked me to repeat them back immediately. I got 4. He read me 3 numbers and asked me to repeat them in reverse order. I transposed 2 of them. Moss wrote something on his notepad. He did not ask me to try again. He did not look up from the page. He simply wrote in the smooth, unhurried motion of a man filling in a form that had already been decided and moved on to the next question. My jaw ached from keeping my face neutral, because I knew every cell in my body knew that the man sitting across from me with his reading glasses and his warm, professional manner had looked at a check for $45,000 and decided that my mind was the price. "Schwartz," I said when he set his pen down. He looked up. "Yes. In your professional opinion." I held his gaze. "Do you think I have a problem?" Something moved behind his eyes. Quick, almost invisible, the flinch of a man who has heard a question he was not expecting to be asked so directly. Then the professional mask settled back into place, smooth and practiced. "I think we're seeing some indicators worth monitoring," he said carefully. "Nothing alarming at this stage, but I'd like to run a full cognitive assessment, the standardized battery. It gives us a clearer picture." "Of course," I said. I smiled at him. "Better safe than sorry." He smiled back. I wanted to put my fist through the wall. Instead, I shook his hand again at the door, thanked Linda on the way out, and sat in my truck in the parking lot for 4 minutes, with both hands on the steering wheel and my eyes closed. Breathing through my nose the way I used to breathe on job sites, when a contractor told me something was fine that was very clearly not fine, and I needed 30 seconds before I said something I could not take back. Marcus called before I reached the highway. "California Superior Court," he said. "A lawsuit was filed against you 2 days ago. Plaintiff is Coastal Legacy Properties, LLC. They're claiming you breached a consulting agreement worth $2.3 million. The highway blurred in front of me. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped the truck. "I never signed a consulting agreement with anyone named Coastal Legacy." "I know. The contract they've attached has your signature on it. Same forgery pattern as the documents in the attic. Marcus paused. This isn't about winning the lawsuit, Walter. This is pressure. They file a multi-million-dollar claim against you, freeze your attention, drain your resources, make you feel like the walls are closing in from every direction. Then Dominic offers to help you settle. All you have to do is sign a few documents. I gripped the steering wheel. Evangeline, I said. I'd already on it. She says the complaint has 3 procedural defects visible from the first page. She's filing a motion to dismiss by end of day. A pause. But Walter, this tells us something important. They're accelerating. Halford is pushing the timeline. I stared out the windshield at the Hudson Valley afternoon, the October light going gold across the tree line. The mountains blue and distant, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people have always wanted to own land and call it home. Then so are we, I said. Marcus called at 7 the next morning while I was still in my work boots, standing in the barn doorway, watching the sun come up over the eastern ridge. I need you to look at something, he said. Not over the phone. Come to the kitchen. I walked back across the frost-stiffened grass and found him at the table with his laptop open and 14 printed pages spread out in 2 rows. He had been up since before 4. There was a coffee mug at his elbow that had gone cold hours ago, and the yellow notepad beside it was dense with figures written in his tight, economical hand. 14 transactions, he said without preamble. Over the past 6 weeks, all moving out of the Prescott Design Group operating account. He pointed to the first page. Look at the amounts. I leaned over the table. $9,400, $8,700, $9,001, $8,250, $9,800. Every single one under $10,000. This is structuring, Marcus said. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, that's Federal Law 31 U.S.C. 5324, any cash transaction over $10,000 triggers an automatic currency transaction report to the federal government. Banks are required to file it. No exceptions. He tapped the page. But if you break the same amount into smaller pieces, each one just under that threshold, you can move the same money without triggering the automatic report. And that's illegal on its own, I said. Federal crime. Even if the underlying money is completely legitimate. The act of structuring, deliberately keeping transactions under $10,000 to avoid reporting is a standalone offense. He paused. 14 transactions. Total moved $1,240,000. 6 weeks. My chest felt like someone had set a concrete block on it and walked away. Where did it go? Marcus pointed to the right-hand column on the 3rd page. 3 destinations. The largest share went to Coastal Legacy Properties, LLC. A smaller portion went directly into a personal account registered to Dominic Hale. He turned to the last page. And $45,000 went to a practice address in Kingston, New York, Moss. The same $45,000 Marcus had found the day before, now confirmed from a second direction. The money had left my company and landed in the hands of the man who was writing a report to strip me of my legal rights. I straightened up slowly. My hands were steady. The rest of me was not. Who else knows about this? I asked. That, Marcus said, is the interesting part. He had called Evangeline the night before. She had made 2 phone calls of her own, and by 8 that morning, the 3 of us were sitting in a conference room at Hudson Valley Regional Bank with a woman named Octavia Brennan. Octavia was 59 years old with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who has spent 31 years watching money move, and has learned that the most important thing you can do in her profession is wait until you are absolutely certain before you act. She wore a plain navy blazer and kept a single legal pad in front of her, already covered in notes she had written before we arrived. She had been expecting us. Not us specifically, but someone. "When I filed an internal suspicious activity report 3 weeks ago," she said, setting a folder on the table between us. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, banks are required to file a SAR with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, when we identify transaction patterns consistent with money laundering or fraud. I had flagged these 14 transactions for review and was preparing to escalate to FinCEN this week. She opened the folder. Inside were the same 14 transactions Marcus had found printed on bank letterhead with her annotations in red ink along the margins. "The structuring pattern is textbook," she said. "Whoever designed this knew exactly where the reporting threshold sits. Every transaction is calibrated to stay just below it." She looked at me directly, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been angry for 3 weeks and has been waiting for the right moment to do something about it. "Mr. Prescott, this is your company's operating account. Money that belongs to your business has been systematically moved out of it in a way designed to avoid federal detection." "Ma, can you stop the remaining transfers?" Evangeline asked. "I've already applied an internal compliance hold," Octavia said. "Under our bank policy, I can freeze suspicious transactions for up to 72 hours pending judicial authorization. There is currently 1 transfer in pending status." She turned to the last page of the folder. $820,000. Destination Coastal Legacy Properties, LLC. It was initiated at 5:03 this morning. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. $820,000. Moving in 3 days if we did nothing. Gone into a Delaware shell company registered to men who had done this before in other states to other families and had walked away clean every time. Evangeline's pen was already moving. 72 hours, she said. "I can get an emergency temporary restraining order before that window closes. I'll need everything you have, the SAR filing the transaction records, the FinCEN correspondence. It's already printed." Octavia slid a second folder across the table without being asked. I looked at the 2 women across the conference table, one who had spent 3 weeks watching stolen money she could not yet stop, and one who had spent 40 years stopping things exactly like this, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief. Not yet. But the first hint of solid ground under what had been for 6 days nothing but open air. "How long to get the restraining order?" I asked Evangeline. She checked her watch. "If I file by noon, I can be in front of a judge by 4. She looked up. "But Walter, once I file, this becomes a matter of record. There is no quiet after this." I thought about the $820,000 sitting in a pending queue somewhere in a server room, pointed at a shell company in Delaware, waiting for a clock to run out. "File it," I said. She filed at 11:50 that morning. By 3:45 we were in front of Judge Patricia Calloway in Ulster County Court. She signed the temporary restraining order at 4:18. The $820,000 stayed exactly where Octavia had frozen it. Octavia closed her folder. For the first time since we had sat down, something that was almost a smile crossed her face. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "your money is still in this building. Let's make sure it stays that way." I went back to the attic on the 3rd morning. Not because Marcus told me to. Not because Evangeline had asked for something specific. I went because I had been lying awake at 4 in the morning running the measurements in my head, and there was a calculation that did not add up. And in 40 years of practice, I had never once been able to let a calculation that did not add up simply sit there unexamined. The safe was in the northeast corner, partially hidden under a canvas dropcloth. I had noticed it on the first sweep with Marcus, and dismissed it an old floor safe, the kind installed in farmhouses in the 70s, more symbolic than secure. We had opened it that first morning and found it empty, except I had not measured it. I crouched down now and ran my tape measure along the outside of the safe, 12 inches deep. I opened the door and measured the interior. 9 inches. I sat back on my heels and looked at the 3-inch discrepancy for a long moment. Then I got a flathead screwdriver from my jacket pocket. I had started carrying one the way other people carry keys, and worked it along the seam of the interior base. The false bottom lifted out cleanly. Someone had fitted it with small, rare earth magnets at the corners, the kind used in cabinet hardware. Precise work. Patient work. Underneath were 2 USB drives, 3 prepaid cell phones with the SIM cards removed, and a notebook with a dark green cover, the kind you find at any drugstore. I photographed everything in place before touching any of it. Then I carried it all downstairs. Marcus went through the notebook while I looked at the USB drives on my laptop. The notebook contained dates, dollar amounts, and abbreviations. GH, DF, GM, HS columns of figures going back 14 months. Marcus cross-referenced the dates against the bank transactions he had already mapped and confirmed 3 matches in the first 10 minutes. The USB drives contained design files. Project files from Prescott Design Group drawings, specifications, correspondence. Files I recognized because I had created some of them. Files that had no business being on a drive hidden in a false-bottomed safe in a farmhouse attic in Ulster County. And then I noticed something. Every file that had been modified, every single one, carried the same timestamp in its metadata. 11:47. Not 11:47 in the morning or evening specifically. Just 11:47 appearing again and again across dozens of files spanning 8 months. I am not a digital forensics expert, but I have worked with enough architects who are meticulous about documentation to know that identical timestamps across unrelated files do not happen by accident. Timestamps are generated automatically by the system. For them to repeat like this, someone had to be setting the clock manually. Someone was leaving a mark. I called Raymond Whitlock from Marcus's phone. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting for a call he did not know how to make himself. We met at a diner outside of Woodstock, 40 minutes from the farm. A corner booth back wall, the kind of place where the coffee comes without asking and nobody looks up from their own business. Raymond was already there when I arrived. He was 26 years old and looked at that moment about 19, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he had not drunk from his shoulders, pulled up around his ears, his eyes moving to the door every time it opened. When he saw me, his whole body exhaled. Then his eyes went red at the rims, and he pressed his lips together hard, fighting something back. "Mr. Prescott." His voice broke on the second word. He cleared his throat. "I'm so sorry. I should have come to you months ago. I knew it was wrong and I didn't know how to—" "Raymond." I sat down across from him and kept my voice even. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because I think you've been trying to tell me something for a long time, and I'm finally ready to listen." He blinked hard. One tear broke loose and he wiped it away fast with the back of his hand, almost angry at himself for it. "The timestamps," he said. 11:47, I said. He nodded, his jaw working. 10 years ago, my mother was in a car accident on the thruway. I had just started at your firm. It was my 3rd week. I didn't have anyone to call." He stopped pressing his fingers against his mouth for a moment. "Mrs. Prescott found out somehow. I don't even know how she knew. She showed up at the hospital, and she sat with me in that waiting room for 4 hours. His voice had gone rough, the words coming out unevenly, like something being pulled apart. 11:47 was when the doctor came out. She was holding my hand when he told me my mother was going to be okay. She was holding my hand like I was her own kid. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon grease, and the particular comfort of an ordinary Tuesday morning in a small Hudson Valley town. I let Raymond take a breath. Certitude. When Dominic started pressuring me, he said, "I didn't know how to warn you without him finding out. I thought if I left something in the files, something only you might look for, maybe you'd see it." He reached into his jacket and set a portable hard drive on the table between us. "Everything is on here. The original files before modification. The emails Dominic sent me. 6 audio recordings I made on my phone." He met my eyes. "New York is a one-party consent state. I was a participant in every conversation I recorded. It's legal." I looked at the hard drive on the table between us. Small, black, unremarkable. "There's one recording in particular," Raymond said. His voice had dropped. "Third file. I need you to hear it before anything else. Before I tell you what was on that recording, what I heard at 3 in the morning that changed everything I thought I knew about my own daughter, drop a 8 in the comments right now. Just let me know you are still in the room with me. This story is still going. And what comes next, I wish I had never had to live through. A quick note. The story you are hearing contains some fictional elements shaped to carry the narrative. It may not reflect any single event. If that is not what you came for, you are free to step away now. No judgment at all. I drove home from Woodstock with the hard drive on the passenger seat. I did not open it that evening. I made dinner I did not taste, washed the dishes, walked the perimeter of the property the way I had started doing every night, checking the service road, the barn doors, the side entrance, and then I sat in the workshop until 10 with the green notebook open in front of me and did not read a single word of it. At 2:58 in the morning, I gave up pretending I was going to sleep. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. I plugged in the hard drive. I found the folder Raymond had labeled simply audio, 6 files. He had named them by date, nothing else. I opened the third one. The recording began with the sound of an office hallway, the muffled hum of an HVAC system, a door closing somewhere down the corridor. Then 2 voices close to the microphone. Raymond must have had his phone in his breast pocket. The audio was slightly muffled but entirely clear. Dominic spoke first. His voice was the voice I had heard across dinner tables for 9 years. The same assured, slightly impatient cadence of a man who considered efficiency a form of respect. "The Moss piece needs to move faster. We're running out of runway on the POA." Then Vivian. Her voice hit me like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. "I know that. But if we push Moss too hard, he gets nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. He's already been paid. Being paid doesn't make someone reliable. It makes them invested, which is different." A pause. "If everything is sitting on Dad's property, nobody looks at us. That only works if Moss delivers the assessment before the end of the month." And Stahl. Humphrey handled it. The notarization went through last week. It's recorded. Then we're set. "We're set," Vivian said, "as long as Dad doesn't start asking questions he shouldn't be asking." The recording ended. I sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. There is a particular kind of pain that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with rage or noise or the sharp, clean shock of something breaking all at once. It comes quietly, the way water comes into a foundation patient, thorough, finding every crack. You do not feel it happening. You only feel it when you realize how long it has been there. I had spent the past week constructing reasons for Vivian. She was afraid of Dominic. She had been manipulated. She did not fully understand what she was participating in. She had been told it was temporary, minor, a technicality that would be undone before it caused real harm. Her voice on that recording undid every single one of those reasons. She had not been confused. She had not been coerced. She had been calculating, careful, and utterly in command of what she was doing. I pressed my palms flat on the table and breathed. Outside, the Hudson Valley night was doing what it always did. The wind off the ridge moving through the tree line. The distant sound of the creek at the east edge of the property. The particular deep country silence that I had come here to find, and that now felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. I picked up Marcus's phone and called Evangeline at 6:15. She answered on the second ring. She had been awake. "And I heard the file," I said. A brief pause. How bad enough that I stopped looking for explanations. My voice came out steadier than I expected. She knew everything. She was managing it. Evangeline exhaled slowly. "Walter, I'm sorry." "Don't." I said it more sharply than I intended. I softened it. "Not yet. Tell me what we do next." She was quiet for 3 seconds. When she spoke again, the sympathy was gone from her voice, replaced by the clean, precise focus that had made her the right person to call. "You don't confront either of them. Not Vivian, not Dominic. Not one word that tells them you know what you know." Her voice was firm. "Dominic is still watching for signs that you're onto him. The moment he feels it, he accelerates everything. We lose the element of timing." "I understand. The notarization Vivian mentioned, Humphrey Stahl. That's our next move. If we can get to him before Dominic does, we have the forgery from the source." I spread the drafting paper on the table in front of me. The diagram I had drawn 2 days before, 6 columns, 6 load points. I uncapped a pen and drew a single line under Humphrey Stahl's name. "There's something else," I said. "On the recording, Vivian said, if everything is sitting on my property, no one looks at them." I looked at the diagram. That's not just a plan to frame me. That's the whole structural logic. My name, my land, my signature. If this falls apart, I absorb it. They walk. Which means, Evangeline said, that the property records, the notarized documents, and the forged POA all have to be dismantled in the right sequence. Pull them in the wrong order, and the whole thing collapses on you instead of them. "Like a demolition," I said. "Exactly like a demolition." I looked at the diagram, at the line under Humphrey Stahl's name. "Then we start with the foundation," I said. "I'll go to Kingston tomorrow." Kingston, New York, sits 40 minutes south of the farm on Route 9W, following the Hudson River through country that has been farmland and river town since before the Revolution. I had driven that road 100 times over the years. That morning, I did not notice the scenery. I was rehearsing. Not what to say. I had decided that in the kitchen at 6:30 while the coffee was still brewing. I was rehearsing how to say it. The sequence, the pace, the precise order in which to place 3 things on a desk so that the man sitting behind it would understand without being told explicitly that the conversation was already over before it began. Humphrey Stahl's office was on Wall Street. Not the Manhattan one, but Kingston's, a narrow block of 19th-century commercial buildings 2 streets up from the waterfront. The sign beside the door read, H. Stahl Notary Public and Document Services, EST 1991. The paint on the sign was faded at the edges, in the way of something that had been there long enough to become invisible. I did not knock. I opened the door and walked in. The office was small, in the way that accumulates gradually, a room that starts out merely modest and slowly fills with the residue of years, until there is barely a corridor between the door and the desk. filing cabinets along both walls, a window that looked onto the brick face of the building next door, a desk lamp burning even at 10 in the morning because the overhead fluorescent had given out, and apparently no one had replaced it. Humphrey Stahl was 58 years old and looked older in the way of men whose worry has been compounding for a long time. He was signing something when I came in. He looked up. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that I thought for a moment he might be sick. I crossed to his desk without speaking. I set down the first item, a photograph Marcus had pulled from the footage Estelle had given us. Dominic and Grant Halford standing at the service entrance to the farm 4 months before I had purchased the property. Their faces were clear. The timestamp was visible in the corner. Humphrey looked at it. His hands, still holding his pen, began to shake. I set down the second item, a printed copy of the power of attorney, filed with Ulster County. His notary stamp in the lower right corner, his commission number, his signature as the certifying officer. Humphrey set the pen down. It rolled to the edge of the desk and fell to the floor. He did not pick it up. I set down the third item, a 2-page document Marcus had pulled from the New York Department of State Records. 2 prior procedural violations on Humphrey's notary commission, filed in 2019 and 2022. Both resolved without formal disciplinary action. Both describing what the filings called irregular notarization practices. 3 things on the desk. Humphrey Stahl looked at all 3 of them. Then he looked at me. And something in him stopped performing. I have watched that moment happen before, the precise instant when a person calculates that the cost of maintaining a story has exceeded whatever the story was protecting. It does not look like relief. It looks like a man who has been holding his breath for 6 months, finally allowed to exhale. "How did you find me?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The stamp on the document," I said. "It took Marcus about 4 hours." He closed his eyes, pressed 2 fingers against his mouth. Then he opened them and looked at the photograph again. "Dominic came to my office in April," he said. "Walked in just like you did. No appointment. Sat down in that chair." He nodded toward the chair I was standing beside. He had a folder. Inside it was documentation of a private debt I had from 6 years ago. $31,000. Borrowed from a man who doesn't use banks. He stopped. The kind of debt that doesn't have a paper trail, but can be made to have other kinds of trails. He told you what he needed. 2 documents. My stamp, my silence. Humphrey's jaw tightened. If I refused the folder or went to the licensing authority, I would lose my commission. His voice cracked on the last sentence, not from self-pity, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a decision he made with open eyes and has never once stopped knowing it was wrong. My wife has been ill for 3 years. My youngest daughter is finishing her degree in the spring. I had nothing else. The office was very quiet. From somewhere outside came the sound of a delivery truck on Wall Street, reversing, beeping steadily. "You kept something," I said. He looked up at me. "Or I wouldn't be here," I said. Humphrey Stahl reached into the bottom drawer of his desk. He used a small brass key on his keychain, the kind that opens a locked drawer, not a safe. The kind that represents the thinnest possible layer of protection, but is better than nothing, and is sometimes all a person has. He placed a brown envelope on the desk between us. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a power of attorney I had executed in March of 2019, naming Eleanor as my agent for all property and business decisions during a period when I had been scheduled for knee surgery, and we had wanted everything properly covered. Dominic had pulled it from the Ulster County Property Records, public documents accessible to anyone who knew where to look. He had given it to Humphrey as a template. Eleanor's name, her signature as accepting agent. Witnessed by a paralegal at Evangeline's firm, notarized by a different office, entirely properly dated. This document had been legally void since Eleanor's death 3 years ago. The second document was the one Dominic had brought to Humphrey's office in April. I placed them side by side on the desk. The forgery did not require expertise to identify. My signature on the false document reached for mine the way a copy always reaches for an original, close enough in shape to suggest familiarity, different enough in the pressure and the angle of the final downstroke to reveal the distance between a practiced hand and an imitated one. The date had been constructed to appear recent. Eleanor's name had been removed. Dominic's had been inserted. The scope of authority had been expanded far beyond anything a personal document would ordinarily contain. "I'm not a good man," Humphrey said. He said it without asking for absolution. "I know what I did." "You kept those," I said. I meant it plainly, not as comfort, not as forgiveness, but as a statement of fact that had legal weight and would continue to have it. "That matters." He nodded slowly. His hands had stopped shaking. I was almost at the door when Marcus called. "Walter." His voice carried the specific compression of a man who has found something and is deciding the most useful way to deliver it. "Dominic just called Halford. He knows something is moving. He's talking about accelerating the final transfer." My hand tightened on the doorframe. "How long?" I asked. "Halford said 48 hours, Marcus said. "Maybe less." I looked back at Humphrey Stahl, sitting behind his desk. The two documents in front of him, the brown envelope open between them. "Tell Evangeline," I said. "And Marcus, we need to move tonight." I was back at the farm by 2 in the afternoon. Marcus was at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 empty coffee mugs lined up along the edge like a timeline of how long he had been sitting there. He looked up when I came in, read my face, and said, "Humphrey gave you something." "2 documents," I said. "The original and the forgery side by side. The signature comparison alone is enough for a forensic examiner." Marcus nodded and went back to his keyboard. That was the thing about working with him. He did not celebrate incremental progress. He filed it and moved forward. I had just hung up my coat when my phone rang. Ulster County Sheriff's Office. My stomach dropped about 2 inches before I caught it. I answered, "Mr. Prescott." The voice was measured and familiar in the way of someone you have spoken to at a town meeting or a hardware store, but never formally. "This is Sheriff Dale Connors. I apologize for calling without warning. I've received a report expressing concern about your welfare, and I'm obligated to follow up. Would it be all right if I stopped by this afternoon?" I looked at Marcus. He had already stopped typing. "Of course," I said. "Come whenever you like. I'll put coffee on." Connors arrived 40 minutes later in an unmarked sedan, which told me he was trying to keep this low-key. He was 52 broad through the shoulders, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades in small county law enforcement and had learned that most situations resolve better when nobody is in a hurry. I recognized him from the county board meeting I had attended in September, 3 weeks after moving in. He had been the one who answered questions from the back of the room without checking his notes. I opened the door before he reached the porch steps. "Sheriff Connors," I said. "Come in. Watch the second step. The board's been loose since I moved in, and I keep forgetting to fix it." He tested the step carefully, then came inside. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him at the kitchen table. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way people do in October in the Hudson Valley when the cold has arrived, but the heating hasn't quite caught up. "I appreciate you being accommodating about this," he said. "These check-ins are never comfortable for anyone." "I've got nothing to hide, Sheriff." I sat down across from him. Who called? He looked at me steadily. I'm not able to share that. But the concern raised was about confusion, disorientation, behavior that seemed out of character. I almost laughed. Instead, I picked up my coffee. I'm 68 years old, I said. I spent 40 years running an architecture firm. I designed the county library annex in 2011, the one on Fair Street with the copper roof. I moved out here 6 weeks ago because my wife passed 3 years ago and I needed a change of scenery, not a change of mental capacity. I paused. I promise you, Sheriff, I know what day it is, who the governor is, and exactly why someone might want a welfare check filed on me right now. Something shifted in Connors's expression. Not alarm, more like a recalibration. The look of a man who came in expecting one kind of conversation and is now having a different one. He asked me a few more questions. Practical ones: how I was managing the property, whether I had local contacts, whether I needed any referrals to county services. I answered each one directly and without hesitation. At one point, I walked him through the workshop to show him the studio space I was setting up, and he spent a genuine 2 minutes looking at the drafting table and the rolled drawings stacked against the wall with the interest of someone who had never been inside a working architect's space before. When we came back to the kitchen, he finished his coffee standing up. "Mr. Prescott," he said, setting the mug down, "you seem like a man who's got everything pretty well in hand." "I'm working on it," I said. He looked at me for a moment, with the patient, observational gaze of someone who has spent 30 years reading rooms and people and situations for what is actually there, rather than what someone has described. Then he said quietly, "Lee, whoever called me seemed a lot more upset than you do." He left without elaborating. I watched his sedan pull out of the drive and disappear down the county road, and then I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in my chest since 2:58 that morning. Marcus looked up from his laptop. "Well, he's sharp," I said. "He knows something doesn't add up. He just doesn't know what yet." Marcus's phone buzzed. He read the screen and looked at me. "Evangeline, the guardianship petition was denied." He set the phone down. "Judge cited insufficient evidence of cognitive impairment. Connors filed his welfare check report an hour ago. Subject appeared fully alert and oriented, no indicators of distress or confusion." He paused. "Connors just became our witness without anyone asking him to." I looked out the kitchen window at the October light going flat and golden across the fields. "Dominic just lost another column," I said. Marcus closed his laptop. "He knows it too. He's going to move faster." He looked at me. "Walter, sir, we need to talk about tonight." Marcus spread the photocopied pages of the green notebook across the kitchen table, and we worked until 9 that evening, cross-referencing every abbreviation against the names and dates he had already mapped. By the time we finished, the picture was complete enough to act on. "There's one name in here," Marcus said, tapping a line near the bottom of the 3rd page, that doesn't match anything in the financial records. The initials, the dates, the amounts, none of it lines up with anyone we've identified. I looked at the line he was pointing to, a set of initials followed by a dollar figure and a date 6 weeks out. "Which means Dominic doesn't know we have this notebook," I said. Marcus looked at me. "Which means he doesn't know what's in it." I picked up a pen. I crossed out the unidentified initials. In their place, I wrote 2 words in block letters: Charles Wexler. Marcus watched me do it without speaking. Then he said, "You're giving him a name to chase." "I'm giving him a name that doesn't exist," I said. "And I want to see how fast he runs with it." I made a clean photocopy of the altered page. The original went into the envelope with Humphrey's documents, which Marcus locked in his car. The altered copy went back into the notebook. The notebook went back into the false-bottomed safe reset exactly as we had found it. Magnets clicked into place, drop cloth repositioned with the same slight diagonal drape it had carried before. Then I called Dominic. I dialed from my own phone, the one Dominic believed was still compromised, and I let my voice go to the place I had been practicing since the night I watched him walk into my house with a key I had never given him. Dominic. I let a small tremor into it. Just enough. Hey, Walter. His voice was easy, warm, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. It made my back teeth ache. Everything okay out there? I don't know. I paused. I found something in the barn this afternoon. An old safe under the floorboards. I can't remember putting anything in there, but there's a notebook inside and some phones, and I don't know whose they are. The silence on his end lasted exactly 1 beat too long. See, I don't touch anything, he said. His warmth had not disappeared, but there was something underneath it now, something pulled tight. It might be something the previous owner left. Could be valuable, could be nothing. Just leave it alone and I'll come take a look. Tonight. No, it's late. I'll come this weekend. Okay. I let the tremor back in. I keep forgetting things, Dominic. I found that safe and I couldn't even remember what room I'd been in an hour before. I'm worried. Another beat of silence. Longer this time. I'll come Saturday, he said. Don't worry about it. Just get some sleep. He ended the call. I set the phone on the table and looked at Marcus. He had his recording equipment already running, a compact digital unit plugged into a directional microphone aimed at the east window, positioned to capture any transmission in the immediate area. Not my phone, not Dominic's. The ambient signal. Now we wait, Marcus said. We did not wait long. At 11:41, Marcus's equipment registered an outgoing call from a cell tower consistent with Dominic's location. The call lasted 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Marcus put on headphones. His expression did not change while he listened, but his pen began moving across his notepad in the fast, compressed shorthand he used when something mattered. When the call ended, he took the headphones off. Grant Halford, he said. Dominic told him about the notebook, told him there was a name in it he didn't recognize. Marcus tapped his notepad. He said the name out loud, Walter. He said Charles Wexler. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the soup we had made for dinner and not finished. Outside, the Hudson Valley night pressed against the windows, cold and black and indifferent. A name I invented 45 minutes ago, I said. A name that doesn't exist anywhere in any public record. Marcus said that Dominic Hale just reported to Grant Halford as though it were real intelligence. He set his pen down. He took the notebook out of that safe, Walter. He read it. He used it. He just proved on a recorded line that he has been accessing documents stored on your property without your knowledge or consent. I looked at the kitchen table where the green notebook had been sitting 6 hours ago, at the empty space where it had been. Halford's response? I asked. Marcus checked his notes. He told Dominic to find out everything he could about Wexler before the end of the week. A pause. And then Fenn got on the line. My chest tightened. Fenn was on the call, last 2 minutes. He told Dominic the timeline was moving to 36 hours. Marcus looked at me steadily. They're closing everything out, Walter. Whatever they haven't transferred yet, they're planning to finish before the weekend. I stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the dark property, the barn outline against the sky, the service road, the tree line where the farm ended, and the state forest began. 36 hours. Call Evangeline, I said. And Marcus, tomorrow morning, I need to tell you something about FBI Special Agent Patricia Morgan. Marcus's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me. She called me 3 days ago, I said. I think it's time we called her back. Patricia Morgan arrived at the farm at 8:15 the next morning in a gray government sedan that she parked without ceremony beside Marcus's car. She was 38, compact, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from years of walking into rooms where people were not glad to see her. She shook my hand, at the door declined coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with a folder already open. I've been working the Fenn Halford network for 14 months, she said, without preamble. 3 states, 7 families. All of them over 60. All of them asset-rich. All of them targeted through someone in their inner circle. She looked at me steadily. You're the 8th. Except I'm still standing, I said. Except you're still standing, she agreed. Which is why I'm here. She laid a single sheet on the table, a federal case number, a filing date of April 2023, and a list of charges that ran to half a page. RICO, wire fraud, elder financial abuse, interstate property fraud. 14 months of surveillance, and we have the outside of this network mapped in detail, she said. What we have never been able to get is the inside. The internal documents, the communications, the recorded conversations. She paused. Until 3 days ago when Marcus called me. She looked at the hard drive sitting on the corner of the table, Raymond's recordings, the original files, the email archive. That drive, she said, closes the chain. Before I could respond, I heard tires on the gravel drive. Estelle Fontaine came through the door, carrying a canvas tote bag and moving with the unhurried authority of a woman who had presided over a courtroom for 31 years and saw no reason to adjust her bearing simply because she had retired. She set the tote on the table and took out a portable hard drive. Matte black, labeled in her handwriting with a single date range. 6 months, she said. From the 1st of April through the end of September. Patricia looked at the drive, then at Estelle. You are Estelle Fontaine. I owned this property until October 15th. She sat down without being invited. I was a New York Supreme Court judge for 31 years. I kept the cameras running because I noticed vehicles on the service road that had no business being there. She folded her hands on the table. I kept the footage because that is what you do when you have spent 3 decades watching people believe they will not be caught. Patricia plugged the drive into her laptop without another word. The footage was organized by date. She went straight to the earliest file, April 3rd, 4 months before I had signed the purchase agreement. The timestamp read 4:47 in the afternoon. On the screen, a dark pickup truck moved up the service road without headlights. 3 men got out. Even in the grainy footage, the broad shoulders and silver hair of Grant Halford were unmistakable. Beside him, a man I recognized as Douglas Fenn from the photographs Marcus had sourced. And behind them, both moving with the familiar forward-leaning stride I had watched cross 100 rooms, Dominic. My son-in-law walked up to the attic entrance of my farmhouse 4 months before I owned it, pointed at the east wall and said something to Halford that made both men nod. My chest tightened until it was difficult to draw a full breath. He planned this before you ever saw the listing, Marcus said quietly. He didn't find this property for me, I said. My voice came out hollow. He built it for me. He found it, he set it up, and then he handed me the address and told me it felt like home. The room was very quiet. except for the sound of the footage playing the muffled scrape of the attic door, the three men moving in and out of frame, Dominic gesturing at the wall where the hidden room would be constructed. Patricia stopped the footage. She looked at me with the direct evaluating gaze of someone whose job requires her to assess people quickly and accurately. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "those documents were placed in that attic before you owned this land. That footage establishes the chain of custody. It means the forgeries were never yours." She closed her laptop. "And it means every element of the case they built against you just collapsed from the foundation." Estelle looked at me across the table. "Dominic chose the wrong farm," I said. She shook her head. "He chose the wrong previous owner." Patricia was already on her phone. Her voice dropped to the clipped, efficient register of someone coordinating something large. "We move tonight," she said into the phone. "Get the asset freeze order ready. All accounts, Coastal Legacy, Hale, Fenn, the Nevada Shell, all of it." A pause. "And get me a line to the Ulster County DA." She ended the call and looked at me. 36 hours just became 12. She said. "She came at 3 in the afternoon. I heard the car before I saw it, the particular sound of Vivian's white sedan on the gravel drive. A sound I had known for 9 years, the sound of Sunday dinners and holiday arrivals and the ordinary traffic of a family moving in and out of each other's lives. She came through the front door without knocking, which she had always done, which she had every right to do, which now felt like something entirely different. She looked like she had not slept in 2 days. Her eyes were red at the rims, her hair pulled back in the hasty way of someone who had stopped caring about appearances somewhere on the drive over. She was still wearing her work clothes, a blazer over a blouse, the kind of outfit she put on in the morning for a different kind of day than this one had become. She stopped when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table. "Dad." Her voice broke on the single syllable. Her chin trembled and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting it. "I need to talk to you." I did not stand up. I did not open my arms. I kept my hands flat on the table and looked at my daughter and felt the particular agony of a man who loves someone completely and cannot allow that love to change what he already knows. "Sit down, Vivian." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table between us, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet, and her voice was barely holding itself together. "Dominic lied to me," she said. "In the beginning, he told me it was just paperwork, a restructuring. He said it would protect the company, protect you. He said—" She stopped, pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. "I believed him, Dad. I believed him because I wanted to. And by the time I understood what it actually was, I was already—" Her voice cracked completely. "I was already inside it." I let her finish. Then I reached across the table and picked up the tablet Marcus had left there that morning. I turned it to face her and pressed play. The footage from that first night filled the screen. The dark pickup rolling in without headlights. 2 figures crossing to the side door. Vivian's face unmistakable in the camera's night vision, her jaw set with the particular determination of someone who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. The color drained from her face so completely, she looked like a different person. I stopped the footage. I opened the audio file on my phone, the 3rd recording from Raymond's drive, and set it on the table between us. Vivian's voice came out of the speaker. "If everything is sitting on Dad's property, nobody looks at us." She made a sound then that I had not heard from her since she was 7 years old and had fallen from the oak tree in our backyard, and understood all at once that she was hurt worse than she had thought. A small, involuntary sound, not a sob, not a cry, something more fundamental than either of those. the sound of a person colliding with the truth of themselves. Her shoulders collapsed inward. Both hands came up to cover her face, and she sat like that for a long moment. Her breath coming in ragged, uneven pulls, her whole body shaking with the effort of holding something together that had already broken. "Vivian." My voice came out steady, even though my chest felt like something had been removed from it. "Take your hands down. Look at me." She lowered her hands. Her face was wet, her eyes swollen, the careful composure she had walked in with entirely gone. "He was going to let you take it," I said. "All of it. If this had fallen apart, every document pointed at you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" I slid a single printed page across the table, a summary Marcus had prepared from the files. Vivian's name on 17 documents, 15 of them forged. 2 of them real, the ones she had signed herself at Dominic's request in January, when he had told her it was routine. "He built a exit," I said. "If the plan failed, you were the one who had authorized everything. He walks. You don't." She stared at the page. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the table to make them stop. And even then, the trembling ran up through her wrists and her arms and into her shoulders. A tear dropped onto the paper and spread into the fiber. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know you didn't know all of it." I leaned forward. "But you knew enough. And you have to carry that." "I can't carry it for you." She looked at me, really looked at me with the raw, stripped open expression of a child who has done something that cannot be undone and is waiting to find out if the person they love most will still be there afterward. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "I love you," I said. "I have loved you every single day of your life. That does not change." I squeezed her hand once firmly, and then I let go. "But love is not the same as protection from consequences. Do you understand that?" She nodded. Her chin was trembling again. "Then I need you to do something." I slid my phone across the table toward her. "I need you to call Evangeline Thorne, and I need you to tell her everything. Not the version that protects you, everything." Vivian looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she picked it up with both hands, the way a person picks up something heavier than it looks, and dialed. Vivian was still on the phone with Evangeline when Patricia Morgan came back through the front door at 4:30. She had been gone 6 hours. In that time, based on what she told us in the next 20 minutes, she had spoken to 3 federal prosecutors, a supervising agent in the Manhattan field office, and a judge in the Southern District of New York, who had agreed to review an emergency asset freeze application before end of business. She sat down, opened her laptop, and looked at Vivian. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "I need you to tell me everything you told that attorney. And then I need you to tell me more." Vivian lowered the phone from her ear. Her eyes were still swollen, but something in her posture had shifted. The collapsed inward look of the woman who had walked in 2 hours ago was gone, replaced by something more deliberate. She had made her choice. She was done protecting the wrong person. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. "October of last year," Patricia said. "The first time Dominic asked you to sign something you didn't fully understand." What followed was the most painful hour I have spent in a long time. Vivian talked, and Patricia typed, and Marcus cross-referenced, and I sat at the end of the kitchen table and listened to my daughter dismantle piece by piece the architecture of a marriage that had been built on a foundation I had never been allowed to inspect. October, Dominic showed her a document. "Routine restructuring," he said. "Just a formality." She signed. November, a second document. Same explanation, different language. She signed again. January, the one she had almost refused. Her name appeared on a page in a way that made her stomach turn. Dominic talked for 40 minutes until the feeling passed. She signed. March, she found the folder. Read 3 lines. Dominic appeared in the doorway and explained it away in the smooth, unhurried manner of a man who had rehearsed the explanation before she ever found the document. She walked out of the room, carrying a fear she had no name for yet. And after March, Patricia said. Vivian's jaw tightened. I started photographing things. His laptop screen when he left the room. Documents on his desk. I didn't have a plan. I just needed something real to hold on to. She unlocked her phone and slid it across the table. 23 photographs organized by date, each one renamed with a month and a number. Patricia scrolled through them without expression. Then she stopped on one and turned the phone toward Marcus. Hatuntu. This email address, she said. This is a direct line to Fenn's operational account. We've been trying to identify this address for 11 months. Marcus leaned in. Vivian photographed it off Dominic's screen in February. Patricia set the phone down. She looked at Vivian with the first genuine warmth I had seen from her all day. Mrs. Hale, she said, that photograph just saved us approximately 4 months of work. Vivian pressed her lips together and looked at the table. She did not look like a person receiving a compliment. She looked like a person doing the only thing left available to them. At 6:15, Patricia closed her laptop and looked at me. Mr. Prescott, I need to ask you formally, will you testify grand jury federal trial, whatever this becomes? Your testimony combined with this evidence closes the RICO pattern across all 3 states. It means Fenn goes to prison, not just Halford. I thought about 7 families. People I had never met who had sat across a table from someone they trusted and signed something they did not fully understand and had lost things that could not be entirely recovered even when the legal process eventually ran its course. Yes, I said. Patricia nodded. She pulled a single page from her folder and slid it across the table. A cooperation agreement, standard federal form, my name typed at the top, a signature line at the bottom. Evangeline should review this before you sign, Marcus said immediately. She already has, Patricia said. I sent it to her this morning. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. My chest was not. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, my actual signature, my real handwriting, the one no one had been able to replicate correctly, and set the pen down. Patricia picked up the document and slid it into her folder. The asset freeze order goes to the judge at 7, she said. If it's granted, we execute at midnight. She stood up and looked around the table at Marcus, at Vivian, at me. I need everyone to stay off their phones tonight. Nothing to Dominic, nothing to anyone connected to him. He cannot know this is coming. She moved toward the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at me. Mr. Prescott. Her voice had shifted just slightly, just enough. 14 months ago, I opened this case because 7 families had lost things they spent their lives building. Tonight, because of what you put together in 4 days. She paused. Those 7 families are going to get a different ending than they expected. She left. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian was looking at her hands in her lap. A single tear ran down her cheek, and she caught it with the back of her wrist without looking up. Marcus closed his laptop, stood and poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the counter with his back to both of us, and I understood that he was giving us a moment he could not manufacture but could at least not interrupt. I looked at my daughter. Go home tonight, I said quietly. Don't contact Dominic. In the morning, Evangeline will tell you what comes next. Vivian nodded without speaking. She stood up, and for a moment she just stood there beside the chair with her coat over her arm, and her eyes still wet, looking at me with an expression that carried more than I knew how to hold. Then she walked out. I listened to her car move down the gravel drive and disappear. Marcus turned around. 6 hours, he said. I know, I said. We sat down and waited for midnight. At 9:45 I called Dominic. Marcus was sitting across the table with his recording equipment running, and his eyes on me, steady and unreadable. Outside the kitchen window, the Hudson Valley night was black and cold, the tree line invisible against the sky, the barn a dark shape at the edge of what the porch light could reach. I let the tremor back into my voice, the one I had practiced. Dominic. I paused. I'm sorry to call this late. Walter. His voice came in warm and alert, not sleepy. He had been waiting. Everything okay? I don't know. I let a breath go, the uncertain kind. I've been thinking about that safe in the barn, about the notebook. I keep trying to remember where it came from, and I can't. A pause. I'm scared, Dominic. I think I need to sign something that puts things in order, in case my memory keeps getting worse. The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. I'll come tonight, he said. You don't have to, I want to. His voice had shifted into the register he used when he was closing something. Smooth, certain, already in motion. I'll be there in an hour. Don't sign anything until I get there. Okay. Just wait for me. Okay, I said. Thank you, Dominic. I ended the call and set the phone down. Marcus looked at me. 1 hour. Less, I said. He won't wait an hour. We moved quickly. I went upstairs and turned on the lamp in my bedroom, dim the way it would look if someone inside was reading before sleep. I pulled the curtains most of the way closed, leaving a thin line of amber light visible from the driveway. Then I came back downstairs, put on my coat, and went out through the back door to where Marcus had parked his car on the service road engine, off lights off 50 yards east of the barn. My own truck sat in the driveway where it always sat. We waited. He made it in 41 minutes. The dark pickup came in from the county road without headlights, the same way it had come that first night 2 weeks ago, the night Estelle had told me to watch, and I had watched, and everything had changed. It rolled past the barn, past my truck, and stopped near the side entrance. Dominic got out alone. He moved to the side door with the key he had never been given and let himself in. A light came on in the mudroom, then footsteps on the stairs, then the attic. Marcus had the camera feed pulled up on his laptop, the same system Estelle had built, the same angles, the same grainy clarity that had shown me the truth 2 weeks ago. We watched the attic light come on. Dominic stood in the center of the room. It was empty. Not reorganized, not searched. Empty, the bins gone, the drop cloth gone, the safe gone. Nothing remaining but the bare boards and the cold air and the faint smell of old timber that every room in this house carried. On the work table, one piece of paper. He crossed to it and picked it up. I had drawn it myself that afternoon by hand, with the drafting pencil I had carried in my shirt pocket for 20 years. A floor plan of the farmhouse, every room, every entrance, every camera position marked with a small numbered circle. Camera 1, Camera 3, Camera 6. The hidden room labeled in my handwriting. The false-bottomed safe. The service road. The side entrance. And at the bottom, 2 lines. You used my house to hide everything. You forgot that I have spent my life learning how to read them. Marcus watched the screen. He's not moving. Dominic stood at that table with the paper in his hands, and did not move for a long time. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the driveway, at my truck, at the dark property. He called someone. Marcus's equipment registered the outgoing signal. No answer. He called again. No answer. A third time. Then he called me. I answered. Walter. His voice had lost everything, the warmth, the ease, the practiced confidence of a man who had been managing me for months. What was left was just a voice, tired and stripped down to its actual weight. What did you do? I read the building, I said. You don't understand what you've... Vivian already talked to Evangeline, I said. Raymond gave us 6 recordings. Humphrey gave us the original and the forgery side by side. Estelle kept 6 months of camera footage starting 4 months before I signed the purchase agreement. I looked out the window of Marcus's car at the dark tree line. And Patricia Morgan has been building a federal case around Douglas Fenn for 14 months. She just needed someone on the inside. Dead air. Dominic. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Not cold, not satisfied. Just quiet the way things go quiet when there is nothing left to perform. The lights outside are not mine. He looked out the attic window. On the service road, 2 sets of headlights came on simultaneously. A third appeared at the end of the driveway. He ended the call. I set the phone on the dashboard and looked through the windshield at the dark farm, the barn, the house, the amber line of the bedroom lamp in the upstairs window, the property I had been handed as a gift and had nearly lost and had fought for in the only way I know how to fight. Marcus started the engine. Neither of us said anything for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. Then Marcus pulled onto the county road, heading back toward the farm, and I watched the lights of the federal vehicles moving through the dark behind the tree line, and I thought about Eleanor and about the building she had always said I could read better than I could read people. She had not been wrong. She had just not been entirely right either. He came the following evening. I had known he would. Not because I could predict Dominic specifically, but because I have spent 40 years understanding how structures behave under stress, and a man who has watched everything he built collapse in a single night does not simply go home and sleep. He goes to the place where the failure began. He goes looking for a conversation that might change the shape of what happened. He had made bail by late afternoon. The federal conditions did not restrict him from this address. An oversight I had not thought to correct. I was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace when I heard his key in the front lock. I had been sitting there for 2 hours. The bourbon was on the side table, poured untouched, the ice long since melted into nothing. The lamp in the corner was on low. Through the windows came the sound of the November wind off the ridge, and somewhere in the distance, the creek. Dominic stepped inside and stopped when he saw me. He was still wearing the clothes from the night before. The dark jacket, the open collar. A man who had dressed for a significant day and had not found a moment since to reconsider himself. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 2 weeks ago, and something in the set of his jaw that I recognized the particular tension of a person who has been holding a version of events together in their mind and has not yet let it go. He crossed to the center of the room and stopped. Walter. His voice was careful, measured. He was still trying. Before you say anything, I need you to understand that what happened was more complicated than it looks. I did not respond. I reached to the side table and placed 4 envelopes on the coffee table between us. One at a time. Photographs. Financial records. The 2 POA documents from Humphrey's drawer. The cognitive assessment Moss had prepared. I did not open any of them. Dominic looked at the envelopes. Then he looked at me. Those have already been reviewed by a federal judge, I said. He changed approach. The careful version disappeared, replaced by something that almost sounded like honesty. The company was in real trouble, he said. I'm not making excuses, I'm telling you the situation. Prescott Design Group was losing ground. The Meridian Commission was the last significant project in the pipeline, and if it fell through, the firm was going to contract badly. I found a way to protect the assets. His voice tightened. I found a way to protect what you spent 40 years building. By forging my signature, I said. By making decisions you weren't in a position to make anymore. He leaned forward. Walter, I've watched you for 3 years since Eleanor died. I've watched you stop caring, stop engaging. You built something extraordinary, and you walked away from it without looking back. Someone had to. I let him finish. Then I picked up my phone from the arm of the chair and pressed play. His own voice came out of the speaker flat and clear in the quiet room. The Moss piece needs to move faster. We're running out of runway on the POA. Then Vivian's voice saying the words I had heard once before at 3 a.m. and had not forgotten for a single hour since. The recording ran for 41 seconds. He did not need to hear all of it to understand. When it ended, the room was so quiet I could hear the wind finding the gap under the front door. Dominic's face had gone through several changes while the recording played. The careful version, the honest version, the defensive version, all of them had passed through, and none of them had stayed. What was left was something I had not seen on him before, something younger and less constructed. He sat down in the chair across from me. He had not been invited. His legs had made the decision before the rest of him caught up. How long have you known? He asked. Long enough, I said. He pressed both hands flat on his knees and looked at the floor between us. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something I almost did not recognize. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was not what I had expected. I told myself it was temporary, he said. I told myself that once the Meridian Commission cleared, I'd put everything back, restructure it properly, make it right. He stopped. I told myself you'd never have to know. And Vivian? I asked. His jaw tightened. He did not answer immediately. She wasn't supposed to be in as deep as she got, he said finally. But you let her sign documents. I needed her name on the restructuring paperwork. You forged her name on 15 of them, I said. You were going to let her carry it if this fell apart. Your own wife. Something moved across his face that I could not fully read. Not guilt exactly. More like a man discovering in real time that he had become something he had not intended to become, and not knowing at what point the distance between intention and reality had grown too large to cross back. He looked up at me. Does it have to end like this? His voice was barely above a whisper. Everything we built, you and me, this family, does it all have to end in a federal courthouse? I looked at my son-in-law. At the left shoulder, sitting slightly lower than the right, a habit from years of carrying a heavy laptop bag on one side. At the hands that had signed my name on documents designed to erase me. At the face of a man I had brought into my family and trusted with things that mattered. I loved you like a son, I said. I want you to know that was real. His chin moved, just slightly. But you made choices, I said. Deliberate, calculated choices over many months that were designed to take everything I built and everything I am and use it against me. I stood up slowly. My knees ached. 7 other families made the same discovery you hoped I would never make. They didn't have what I had. They lost things they will never entirely get back. I walked to the front door and opened it, The November night came in cold, clean smelling of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. "Good night, Dominic." He sat in the chair for a long moment. Then he stood. He walked across the room and through the door without looking at me, and went down the porch steps into the dark, with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who is paying attention to where he puts his feet, because the ground beneath him can no longer be assumed. I closed the door. I stood with my hand on the latch and listened to his truck start, a sound I had heard hundreds of times at the end of Sunday dinners and holiday visits, a sound that had always meant the night was winding down and things were ordinary. The engine faded down the county road. I went back to the armchair. I picked up the bourbon, held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the glass, the cold of it. Then I set it down without drinking. There was nothing I wanted to blur. The civil judgment came down on a Thursday morning in February. Judge Patricia Calloway read the findings in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and institutional heat, and I sat in the gallery with Evangeline on my left and Marcus on my right, and listened to the legal architecture of what had been done to me get taken apart piece by piece. The power of attorney of May 26th was declared void ab initio, without legal effect, from the moment it was executed, as though it had never existed. Every transaction conducted under it was unwound. The full assets of Prescott Design Group, totaling $8.3 million, were ordered returned to Walter James Prescott. The Meridian Commission, 3 years of my life, every drawing, every calculation, every argument I had won in 6 rounds of client revision, returned to its originating architect. The federal sentences had been handed down the previous week. Dominic, 12 to 15 years. Halford, 18 to 22. Douglas Fenn, extradited from California, awaiting a separate trial. Gerald Moss, medical license revoked, $180,000 in fines and restitution, 36 months probation. Humphrey Stahl, full cooperation, reduced to a misdemeanor, supervised probation. Arthur Gaines testified in the civil proceedings as a material witness. Raymond Whitlock cooperated fully with federal investigators. His recordings and documentation were entered as primary evidence. He was not charged. Vivian testified on the second day of the civil proceedings. She sat in the witness chair in a gray blazer and spoke for 2 hours without looking at Dominic's empty seat across the room. She was precise. She did not soften anything. When opposing counsel tried to suggest she had been coerced at every step, she shook her head and said clearly enough for the gallery to hear, "I made choices. I made wrong choices. I am not asking this court to pretend otherwise." I was proud of her for that. It did not change what came next. Vivian received a suspended sentence and 3 years probation. She would pay restitution. She would complete community service. Her name would appear in court records that do not disappear. She had asked me the night before she testified if I would sit in the front row. I told her I would be there, and I was. But I did not speak to the judge on her behalf, did not write a letter, did not ask Evangeline to argue for leniency beyond what the cooperation agreement already provided. Being her father did not mean absorbing consequences that belonged to her. She understood that. It did not make it easier for either of us. After the judgment, I walked out of the courthouse into the February cold and found Estelle waiting on the steps. She had driven up from her new place outside Rhinebeck, where she had settled after the sale. She was wearing a wool coat the color of the sky before a storm, and she held a canvas bag against her side with both hands. We drove back to the farm together without speaking much. She made tea in the kitchen while I stood at the window looking out at the fields, which were brown and frost-covered and entirely still. She set a cup in front of me and sat down across the table. Then she reached into the canvas bag and placed an envelope on the table between us. My name on the front. The handwriting unmistakable. My throat closed before I had read a single word. Eleanor. She gave this to me 2 months before she died, Estelle said quietly. She asked me to hold it until the right moment. A pause. I have been waiting 3 years to understand when that moment was. I opened the envelope with hands that were not entirely steady. The letter was 1 page. Eleanor's handwriting small and precise the way she wrote when she was being careful about something. Near the end, 1 paragraph stopped me completely. She had written, "He will read the cracks in every building he enters for the rest of his life. But the people he loves, he sees them as they could be, not as they are. That is his greatest gift. It is also his greatest blind spot. Someone needs to tell him when to look more carefully." I folded the letter and held it in both hands. Outside, the February light was thin and flat across the frozen fields. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the far tree line. Eleanor had always loved hawks. She said they understood that patience was a form of power. "She knew me better than I knew myself," I said. "She knew you exactly as well as you deserved to be known," Estelle said. "And she loved you anyway. That is not a small thing." That evening, I went up to the attic. I stood in the center of the room. No hidden door, no false-bottomed safe, no bins stacked against the wall. Just the old timber frame and the winter quiet, and the smell of the house doing what old houses do when they have been through something and are resting. I reached for the light switch and turned it on. No truck appeared on the service road, no footsteps on the stairs, no voice from the dark asking about folders. Just the room, just the light, just the sound of the wind finding the eaves the way it always had long before any of this. Long before I had arrived to make any of it mean something. I went downstairs, unlocked the workshop, and spread a clean sheet of drafting paper across the table. I picked up my pencil, and I began. I am Walter Prescott. I spent 40 years designing buildings meant to outlast me. I calculated load paths and stress points, and the precise angle at which a roofline would meet the sky. I understood better than most people that a structure is only as strong as what you cannot see. The foundation beneath it, the joints inside the walls, the decisions made before the first brick was ever laid. And I almost lost everything because I forgot to apply that same understanding to the people closest to me. Family betrayal does not arrive with a warning. It does not knock on the front door and announce itself. It comes the way structural failure comes slowly, invisibly, through the places you stopped inspecting because you trusted them too completely. I trusted my son-in-law with my firm, my finances, and my future. I trusted my doctor with the record of my body across 12 years. I trusted my daughter with the assumption that love was enough to make someone choose right. Not one of those trusts was foolish on its own. What was foolish was believing that trust once given does not need to be maintained. Eleanor tried to tell me. Even from the other side of everything, she found a way to say it. You see the cracks in every building. But the people you love, you see them as they could be, not as they are. I believe God gives us discernment for a reason, not to make us suspicious of everyone around us, not to turn us into people who hold the world at arm's length and call it wisdom, but to make us present, attentive, willing to look clearly at the things and the people we have decided to trust, and to keep looking not just once but across time. Silent Father Revenge is not about anger. It is not about punishment. It is about a man who built things with his hands and his mind for 40 years, who almost had it all taken without a sound, and who chose to fight back the only way he knew how, quietly, methodically, one piece of evidence at a time. That is what silent revenge looks like when it belongs to a father. That is what silent father revenge looks like when the man doing it has spent a lifetime learning how structures hold. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think of someone you know or something you have been ignoring or a trust you have been giving without examining, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you saw in this story that felt familiar. If someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will fix anything, but because sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is hand them a story that says you are not alone in this, and it is not too late to look clearly. Subscribe if you want to stay. The stories ahead are about ordinary people who faced extraordinary betrayals and found somewhere inside themselves the same quiet strength that Walter Prescott found on a farm in the Hudson Valley on a cold October night. Thank you for being here until the very end. The names, locations, and specific events in this story are fictional and have been constructed for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons or situations is coincidental. But the truth underneath this story about trust, about family, about what we owe the people who built something and handed it to us, that part is real. That part I believe you already knew. I spent 40 years reading buildings. I never once thought to read the people inside my own home. That was my failure, not theirs. God gives every one of us the ability to see clearly, but only if we choose to use it before the damage is done, not after. Don't wait the way I waited. Don't love so completely that you stop paying attention. Trust is not a door you lock once and never check again. It is a structure that needs maintenance, inspection, and the courage to acknowledge when something has shifted in the walls. This is what I believe, and I will say it plainly. Family stories' revenge are not born from hatred. They are born from a man who gave everything and nearly lost everything and chose to fight back quietly with patience and evidence the way he had built everything else in his life. Family drama revenge does not look like rage. It looks like a 68-year-old man sitting on the floor of a dark kitchen at 3 in the morning, listening to the truth and deciding what to do with it. That kind of family story's revenge belongs to anyone willing to look clearly at what they love. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. If someone needs to hear it, share it. And if you want to stay for what comes next, you already know where the subscribe button is. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements created for reflection and awareness. If that is not what you are looking for, no judgment. Step away and find what serves you better.